Picture this. You're scrolling through your Facebook feed on a rainy Tuesday evening in March 2024. You click on a vintage car group because you like classic Mustangs. And there, in a photo of smiling middle-aged men at a car show in Phoenix, Arizona, you see a face that's been haunting missing person posters for nearly 3 decades. That's exactly what happened to Jennifer Parker, a 34-year-old facial recognition specialist working for a tech startup in Portland, Oregon. Jen had grown up in Cedar Falls, Iowa, a town of 40,000 people where everyone knew everyone else's business. She remembered the summer of 1995 like it was yesterday. She was 11 years old, riding her pink Huffy bicycle to the community pool when she saw the first missing poster taped to a telephone pole on Elm Street. Billy Thompson, 16 years old, sandy brown hair, blue eyes, 5'7", tall, 140 pounds. Last seen wearing a Chicago Bulls jersey, number 23, and black Converse high tops. He'd been riding his mountain bike home from Cedar Falls High School on August 15, 1995, when he simply vanished. The bike was found 3 days later in a cornfield 2 miles outside town, but Billy was gone. Jen's mother, Patricia Parker, had been Billy's English teacher that year. She remembered him as a quiet kid who wrote poetry and loved Stephen King novels. His parents, Robert and Mary Thompson, were devastated. Robert owned Thompson's hardware store on Main Street, and Mary worked part-time at the Cedar Falls Public Library. They were solid, church-going people who never missed a PTA meeting or a school play. The investigation consumed Cedar Falls for months. The Iowa Division of Criminal Investigation brought in dogs, helicopters, and dozens of volunteers who combed through cornfields and wooded areas along the Cedar River. They interviewed classmates, teachers, and anyone who might have seen Billy that Tuesday afternoon. The FBI eventually got involved, suspecting he might have been abducted and taken across state lines. But nothing. No ransom demands, no credible sightings, no body. Billy Thompson had simply disappeared into thin air on a humid August afternoon, leaving behind a family that would never recover and a small town that would never forget. Jen moved to Oregon after college, earned a master's degree in computer science, and specialized in facial recognition technology. She worked on algorithms that helped law enforcement agencies identify suspects from security footage and social media photos. The irony wasn't lost on her that she spent her days finding people who didn't want to be found, while Billy Thompson remained the one person from her childhood who couldn't be found at all. On March 12, 2024, Jen was at home in her southeast Portland apartment, rain drumming against the windows, when she decided to browse the Classic Mustang Enthusiasts Facebook group. She'd been thinking about buying a vintage car, maybe a 1967 fastback in candy apple red. The group had 47,000 members who shared photos of their restorations, asked technical questions, and posted pictures from car shows across the country. She scrolled through photos from a meetup in Scottsdale, Arizona, held the previous weekend. Dozens of gleaming Mustangs lined up in perfect rows, their owners standing proudly beside their machines. Chrome bumpers reflected the desert sun. Engine compartments displayed pristine V8s with polished valve covers and red air cleaners. Then she saw him. Fourth car from the left, standing next to a 1965 Mustang coupe in Guardsman blue. A man in his late 40s, wearing a grey polo shirt and khaki shorts, thinning sandy brown hair, weathered face, slight crow's feet around his eyes. He was smiling, one hand resting on the Mustang's fender, the other holding a trophy that read, "Best Paint Restoration." Jen's coffee mug slipped from her hands and shattered on the hardwood floor. The face was older, aged by nearly 30 years of sun and time. But the bone structure was identical, the spacing between the eyes. The shape of the nose, the distinctive cleft in the chin that she remembered from those missing person posters. Billy Thompson wasn't missing anymore. He was standing in a parking lot in Arizona, winning awards for his classic car restoration work, looking like he'd been living a perfectly normal life for the past 3 decades. Jen's hands trembled as she took a screenshot of the photo. She zoomed in on the man's face, studying every detail. Her professional training kicked in, noting the facial landmarks that algorithms used for identification, the distance between pupils, the width of the nose bridge, the angle of the jawline. She opened her laptop and launched the facial recognition software she used for work. The program could compare photos across decades, accounting for aging, weight changes, and even cosmetic surgery. She uploaded the screenshot and began searching through her personal archive of old photos from Cedar Falls. She found what she was looking for in a folder labeled Hometown Memories, a digital scan of Billy Thompson's school yearbook photo from 1995. Sophomore year, Cedar Falls High School. The same shy smile, the same bright blue eyes, captured just months before he disappeared. She ran the comparison. The software analyzed 128 distinct facial features, measuring distances, angles, and proportions. It accounted for nearly 3 decades of aging, calculating how a 16-year-old's face would naturally develop into that of a man in his late 40s. The results appeared on her screen in bright green text. 94.7% facial match probability. Jen sat back in her desk chair, staring at the numbers. In her 5 years working with facial recognition technology, she'd never seen a match that high for someone missing for nearly 30 years. The algorithms were designed to be conservative, accounting for false positives and the natural changes that time brings to human faces. But this wasn't a false positive. This was Billy Thompson, alive and apparently thriving in Arizona, 30 years after vanishing from a small Iowa town on a Tuesday afternoon in August. Her phone buzzed with a text from her mother back in Cedar Falls. "Thinking of you, honey. Dad's birthday is next week. Are you coming home?" Patricia Parker had never forgotten Billy Thompson either. She still taught English at Cedar Falls High, and every August, when the new school year began, she thought about the quiet boy who wrote beautiful poetry and never came back to class. Jen stared at the Facebook photo again, the man calling himself someone else. She could see a name tag in the photo that read Mike Davidson. Looked happy, genuinely happy. He was surrounded by friends, holding a trophy, living what appeared to be a successful life. But in Cedar Falls, Iowa, Robert and Mary Thompson had spent nearly 3 decades wondering if their son was dead or alive. Robert was now 71. Mary was 68. They'd never remarried, never moved away, never stopped hoping that somehow, someday, Billy would walk through their front door. Here's where Jen's discovery would change everything, because what she didn't know yet was that Mike Davidson of Phoenix, Arizona, wasn't just living under a false identity. He was living someone else's life entirely. A life built on documents that belonged to a real person who had died in infancy 32 years earlier. And when Jen decided to dig deeper, she would uncover a network of forged documents, stolen social security numbers, and an underground railroad of identity theft that had been operating across the American Southwest since the 1980s. The rain continued to fall against her Portland apartment windows as Jen realized she was holding the key to solving one of Iowa's longest-running missing person cases. But she was also about to destroy the carefully constructed life of a man who might have had very good reasons for disappearing in the first place. She looked at her laptop screen again, at the facial recognition software displaying its confident verdict. Billy Thompson, missing since 1995, found at last. But finding him was about to become the easy part. The next morning, Jen called in sick to work. She spent the day researching everything she could find about Mike Davidson of Phoenix, Arizona. His Facebook profile was public, filled with photos of classic car shows, barbecues with friends, and hiking trips in the Sonoran Desert. He worked as a manager at a specialty automotive parts company called Desert Classic Components. He'd been there for 15 years, according to his LinkedIn profile. His employment history showed a gap between 1995 and 2009. Nothing. No work experience, no education records, no digital footprint whatsoever for the first 14 years after Billy Thompson disappeared from Cedar Falls. Jen's experience with facial recognition software had taught her to dig deeper into identity verification. She accessed public records databases, searching for Mike Davidson's history in Arizona. What she found made her stomach turn. Michael Davidson had been born in Phoenix on July 3, 1978, and died of sudden infant death syndrome on September 12, 1978. He was 71 days old. His death certificate was filed with Maricopa County, and his Social Security number was issued posthumously for administrative purposes. Someone had been using a dead baby's identity for over 20 years. The realization hit Jen like a physical blow. Billy Thompson hadn't just run away from home. He'd somehow acquired the complete identity of a child who had died decades before his disappearance. This wasn't a simple case of a troubled teenager leaving home and starting fresh. This was sophisticated identity theft, requiring access to birth certificates, social security cards, and enough documentation to fool employers, banks, and government agencies. Jen had stumbled onto something much bigger than a missing person case. She was looking at evidence of an organized identity theft operation that had been helping people disappear and assume new lives for decades. Her phone rang. It was her mother. "Jen, I was talking to Mary Thompson at the grocery store yesterday. She's not doing well, honey. The cancer is back and the doctors aren't optimistic. She keeps saying she just wants to know what happened to Billy before she dies." Mary Thompson was dying, and she was less than 1,000 miles away from her son, who was living under a stolen name and apparently had no idea that his mother was fighting for her life. Jen made a decision that would change everything. She opened her email and began typing a message to the Phoenix Police Department's Missing Persons Division. She attached the facial recognition analysis, the comparison photos, and her findings about the Michael Davidson identity theft. But as her finger hovered over the send button, she hesitated. What if Billy Thompson had run away for a good reason? What if there were things about his disappearance that nobody in Cedar Falls knew? What if exposing his new identity would put him in danger? And what about Mike Davidson's life in Phoenix? He had friends, a job, a community. He'd been contributing to society, paying taxes, living as a productive citizen for over 2 decades. Was it fair to destroy that life based on a facial recognition match and some database searches? Jen realized she was facing the same ethical dilemma that plagued her entire profession. Facial recognition technology could find anyone, anywhere, at any time. But just because they could find someone didn't mean they should. The software had done its job perfectly. It had identified Billy Thompson with 94.7% accuracy after nearly 30 years. But the human questions were much more complicated than any algorithm could solve. She saved the email as a draft and closed her laptop. Outside her apartment, Portland was waking up to another overcast day. The rain had stopped, but grey clouds promised more to come. Jen looked at her phone, at her mother's text about Mary Thompson's cancer diagnosis, and made a different decision. She booked a flight to Phoenix. If she was going to destroy someone's life, she was going to look them in the eye first. The Southwest Airlines flight from Portland to Phoenix Sky Harbor took 2 hours and 47 minutes. Jen spent most of the time staring out the window, watching Oregon's green forests give way to Nevada's brown mountains, and finally to Arizona's red desert landscape. She'd packed a small carry-on bag and told her boss she was taking a few personal days to deal with a family situation. It wasn't exactly a lie. She'd spent the previous evening researching Desert Classic Components, the automotive parts company where Mike Davidson worked as a manager. According to their website, they specialized in hard-to-find components for muscle cars and vintage vehicles from the 1960s and 1970s. The business had excellent online reviews and appeared to be thriving in Phoenix's classic car restoration community. Mike Davidson's LinkedIn profile showed he'd been promoted 3 times in 15 years. His colleagues wrote recommendations praising his knowledge of automotive history and his dedication to customer service. One review called him the most honest guy in the business and mentioned that he'd helped restore a 1969 Boss 429 Mustang that had been in the customer's family for 40 years. Everything about Mike Davidson's life in Phoenix suggested he was exactly what he appeared to be, a hard-working, well-respected member of his community who happened to love classic cars. Everything except the fact that he was living under a dead child's identity and had been missing from Iowa for nearly 30 years. Jen's rental car, a silver Ford Escape, came with a GPS navigation system that guided her from Sky Harbor Airport to a hotel in Scottsdale, about 20 minutes from Desert Classic Components. She'd chosen the hotel carefully. It was close enough to Mike Davidson's workplace that she could observe him without traveling far, but far enough away that she wouldn't accidentally encounter him at a restaurant or coffee shop. She checked into her room on the 3rd floor, overlooking a parking lot filled with palm trees and luxury SUVs. The Arizona heat hit her immediately when she stepped outside. 89 degrees in March, with bright sunshine and air so dry it made her lips chap within minutes. Cedar Falls, Iowa had been buried under 3 feet of snow when she'd left Portland. Here in Phoenix, people were wearing shorts and T-shirts, and the swimming pool at her hotel was filled with guests enjoying what felt like summer weather. She drove past Desert Classic Components twice before parking across the street at a Starbucks coffee shop. The business was located in an industrial area of Phoenix, surrounded by auto repair shops, tire stores, and other automotive-related businesses. The building was a converted warehouse with large bay doors and a parking lot filled with classic cars in various stages of restoration. Through the coffee shop window, she could see employees coming and going from Desert Classic Components. Most were men in their 30s and 40s, wearing company polo shirts and work pants stained with grease and primer. They looked like exactly what they were, specialists who spent their days elbow-deep in vintage engines and restoration projects. At 5:47 p.m. she saw him. Mike Davidson walked out of the main building, carrying a leather messenger bag and wearing the same grey polo shirt she'd seen in the Facebook photo. He was taller than she'd expected, probably close to 6 feet now, significantly bigger than the 5'7", 16-year-old Billy Thompson, who had disappeared in 1995. He walked to a burgundy pickup truck parked near the building's main entrance. It was a restored Ford F-100 from the late 1960s, painted in perfect condition with chrome bumpers that gleamed in the late afternoon sun. Jen watched him drive away, heading north toward Scottsdale. She followed at a distance, careful to maintain several car lengths and change lanes frequently to avoid detection. Her 5 years working with law enforcement had taught her basic surveillance techniques, though she'd never expected to use them for a missing person case from her own childhood. Mike Davidson drove to a middle-class neighborhood in Scottsdale, pulling into the driveway of a modest ranch-style house painted in desert beige with red tile roof. The front yard was landscaped with native plants, prickly pear cactus, desert sage, and a large Palo Verde tree that provided shade over a flagstone pathway. Jen parked 3 houses away and watched as Mike Davidson unlocked his front door and disappeared inside. Lights came on in what appeared to be a kitchen window. Through partially open blinds, she could see him moving around, apparently preparing dinner. The house looked like it belonged to a single person. No children's toys in the yard, no evidence of a wife or family. Just a well-maintained home owned by a man who seemed to live quietly and alone in the Arizona desert. Jen sat in her rental car for over an hour, watching the house and trying to build up the courage to knock on the door. What was she supposed to say? "Hi, I think you're a missing person from Iowa." I ran your face through facial recognition software and you matched a 16-year-old who disappeared in 1995. Every scenario she imagined seemed ridiculous or potentially dangerous. If Mike Davidson really was Billy Thompson, he'd spent 30 years hiding his identity for a reason. Exposing himself to a stranger could put him at risk. If he wasn't Billy Thompson, she was about to accuse an innocent man of being someone he wasn't, based on nothing more than facial recognition software and internet research. As darkness fell over the Phoenix suburbs, Jen drove back to her hotel without making contact. She'd flown halfway across the country to confront a man about his identity, and when the moment came, she couldn't bring herself to do it. She spent the evening in her hotel room, staring at her laptop screen and the facial recognition results that had started this entire journey. The software still showed a 94.7% match between Mike Davidson's face and Billy Thompson's 1995 yearbook photo. But facial recognition technology wasn't infallible. There had been false positives before, cases where innocent people were arrested or accused of crimes based on algorithmic matches that later proved to be wrong. What if she was about to destroy someone's life based on a statistical analysis that was simply incorrect? Her phone buzzed with a text from her mother. "Thinking about you. Is everything okay?" Jen typed back, "Working on a project. I'll call you tomorrow." She couldn't bring herself to tell her mother that she might have found Billy Thompson. Not yet. Not until she was absolutely certain. The next morning, Jen returned to the Starbucks, across from Desert Classic Components. She ordered a large coffee and a breakfast sandwich, then settled into the same window seat she'd occupied the previous day. Her plan was simple. Observe Mike Davidson for a full day. Look for any behaviors or mannerisms that might confirm or contradict his identity as Billy Thompson. At 7:23 a.m., the burgundy Ford F-100 pulled into the Desert Classic Components parking lot. Mike Davidson got out, carrying the same leather messenger bag and wearing a different polo shirt. This one was navy blue, with the company logo embroidered on the chest. Jen watched him interact with other employees as they arrived for work. He seemed popular and well-respected, greeting everyone with handshakes or brief conversations. She could see him gesturing as he talked, apparently describing something technical or mechanical to a younger employee who listened carefully and took notes. At 10:15 a.m., Mike Davidson left the building and walked to a nearby auto parts store. Jen followed on foot, staying far enough behind to avoid detection, but close enough to observe his behavior. In the parts store, she watched him examine a carburetor rebuild kit, turning it over in his hands and inspecting the components carefully. He talked to the counter clerk about compatibility issues with 1960s Ford engines, demonstrating an encyclopedic knowledge of automotive specifications and part numbers. The conversation lasted 20 minutes. Mike Davidson knew exactly which gaskets were needed for a 390 cubic inch V8, which jets were required for proper fuel mixture, and which aftermarket manufacturers produced the most reliable components. His expertise was genuine and comprehensive, the kind of knowledge that could only come from decades of hands-on experience. Jen found herself wondering how a 16-year-old boy from Iowa could have developed such specialized automotive knowledge. Billy Thompson had been interested in cars, according to her mother's memories, but he'd been a high school student with no formal training in automotive restoration. Unless he'd spent the past 30 years learning everything there was to know about classic car repair and restoration. At 11:30 a.m., Mike Davidson returned to Desert Classic Components. Jen watched him work through the building's large windows, seeing him consult with customers who brought in photos of their restoration projects. He pointed to catalogs, wrote notes on order forms, and occasionally walked customers out to the parking lot to look at examples of completed restorations. Everything about his behavior suggested a man who was exactly what he appeared to be, an expert in his field, comfortable with his identity, and confident in his knowledge. But at 2:17 p.m., something changed. Mike Davidson walked out of the building to make a phone call. He paced back and forth in the parking lot, one hand holding his cell phone to his ear and the other gesturing emphatically as he talked. Even from across the street, Jen could see that he was upset about something. The conversation lasted nearly 15 minutes. When it ended, Mike Davidson stood motionless in the parking lot for several minutes, staring at his phone. Then he looked directly at the Starbucks where Jen was sitting. Their eyes met through the coffee shop window. Jen's heart started pounding. Had he noticed her surveillance? Was he suspicious about the woman who'd been sitting in the same spot for 2 days, watching his workplace? Mike Davidson started walking across the street, heading directly toward the coffee shop. Jen's first instinct was to run. She gathered her laptop and phone, preparing to leave through the back exit. But something made her stop. Maybe it was professional curiosity. Maybe it was the memory of Mary Thompson's cancer diagnosis. Maybe it was simply the realization that she'd come too far to turn back now. She stayed in her seat and waited for Mike Davidson to enter the coffee shop. He was bigger than she'd expected, not just taller, but broader through the shoulders and chest. The kind of physical development that comes from decades of manual labor and working with heavy automotive components. His face showed the weathering of someone who'd spent years in the desert sun, but his blue eyes were exactly the same shade she remembered from Billy Thompson's missing person posters. He approached her table directly, without ordering coffee or pretending to be there for any other reason. "You've been watching me for 2 days," he said quietly. "Who are you?" Jen's mouth went dry. She'd rehearsed this conversation dozens of times, but now that the moment had arrived, she couldn't remember any of her carefully planned speeches. "My name is Jennifer Parker," she said. "I'm from Cedar Falls, Iowa." Mike Davidson's face went completely white. He sat down heavily in the chair across from her, staring at her with an expression that mixed terror and recognition. "Cedar Falls," he repeated softly. "I think you know why I'm here," Jen said. Mike Davidson, or Billy Thompson, if her facial recognition software was correct, closed his eyes and took a deep breath. "How did you find me?" he asked. "Facial recognition technology. I saw a photo of you in a Facebook group about classic cars. The software identified you as Billy Thompson with a 94.7% probability match." He opened his eyes and looked at her with something that might have been admiration or might have been resignation. "Facial recognition," he said. "I always knew that would be how it ended. I just thought I'd have more time." Jen felt her heart racing. He hadn't denied being Billy Thompson. In fact, his response was tantamount to a confession. "Your parents are still alive," she said. "Your mother has cancer. She's dying, and she doesn't know if you're dead or alive." Mike Davidson, Billy Thompson, put his head in his hands. "I know," he whispered. "I've been watching them online for years. I know about Mum's diagnosis. I know Dad closed the hardware store last year. I know they never moved away from the house on Maple Street. Then why haven't you contacted them?" Billy looked up at her, and for the first time she could see the frightened 16-year-old boy behind the weathered face of the 47-year-old man. "Because I can't," he said. "Because if I surface as Billy Thompson, I'll be dead within a week." Jen felt a chill run down her spine despite the Arizona heat. "What happened in Cedar Falls?" she asked. "Why did you disappear?" Billy Thompson looked around the coffee shop, checking to make sure no one was listening to their conversation. Then he leaned forward and began to tell her a story that would explain not only his disappearance, but also the sophisticated identity theft operation that had kept him hidden for nearly 3 decades. "I didn't run away," he said quietly. "I was taken." The words hung in the air between them like a physical presence. Jen had expected many possible explanations for Billy's disappearance, but kidnapping hadn't been at the top of her list. "Taken by who?" she asked. "A man named Carl Brennan. He wasn't from Cedar Falls. He was passing through town, working construction on the new highway extension. He'd been watching me for weeks, learning my routine, figuring out when I'd be alone. Billy's voice was steady, but his hands were shaking slightly as he spoke. August 15th, 1995. I was riding my bike home from school, taking the back road along the cornfields like I always did. Carl pulled up beside me in a pickup truck and asked for directions to the interstate. When I got close enough to help him, he grabbed me and threw me in the back of the truck. Jen felt sick. The image of a 16-year-old boy being abducted in broad daylight, less than 2 miles from his home, was almost too horrible to process. He drove me to a cabin in the woods, about 3 hours north of Cedar Falls. There were other kids there, runaways mostly, but some who'd been taken like me. Carl was running a trafficking operation, moving kids across state lines and selling them to people who wanted workers for illegal operations. "You were trafficked," Jen said, barely able to speak the words. "For almost 2 years. I was moved from place to place, Colorado, Nevada, California. I worked in illegal marijuana grows, meth labs, places where they needed people who couldn't go to the police or complain to labor authorities. Kids who were already missing, who no one would look for, in the right places." Billy paused, staring out the coffee shop window at the Phoenix traffic. "In 1997, I was working at a marijuana farm in Northern California when the operation got raided by the DEA. Most of the workers scattered into the mountains, but I got caught. When the agents processed me, I told them I was a kidnapping victim from Iowa. I gave them my real name, my parents' information, everything. What happened? They ran my information through their databases and told me that Billy Thompson was dead, officially dead. A body had been found in the Cedar River 3 months after I disappeared, and my parents had identified it as me based on clothing and personal effects. There had been a funeral, a burial, a death certificate filed with the state of Iowa. Jen felt the world tilting around her. "But you were alive." "I was alive, but Billy Thompson was legally dead. The DEA agents thought I was lying about my identity to avoid deportation or prosecution. They processed me as a John Doe and turned me over to Immigration and Customs Enforcement." "How did you end up in Arizona?" "I escaped from an ICE detention facility in Texas in 1998. I walked across the desert for 6 days before a trucker picked me up outside of El Paso. He brought me to Phoenix and introduced me to people who helped undocumented workers get fake identification." Billy reached into his wallet and pulled out a driver's license with his photo and the name Michael Davidson. "They gave me the identity of a baby who had died in infancy. Birth certificate, social security card, school records, everything I needed to start over. I was 19 years old, and I'd been legally dead for 3 years. Jen stared at the driver's license, seeing Mike Davidson's photo, but knowing she was looking at Billy Thompson, a man who had been buried and mourned by his parents while he was still alive. "The body in the Cedar River," she said. "Who was it?" "I don't know," Billy admitted. "Probably another victim of Carl Brennan's trafficking ring, someone else's kid who didn't make it home." The coffee shop suddenly felt too small, too warm, too normal for the conversation they were having. Jen needed air, space, time to process what she'd just learned. "Have you tried to contact law enforcement to tell them you're alive?" Billy shook his head. "I researched it for years. Legally, I'm dead. My death certificate is filed in 3 different databases. My parents collected life insurance benefits. My grave has a headstone with my name on it. Proving that I'm alive would require DNA testing, court orders, investigations that would expose not only my current identity, but also the people who helped me get fake documents." "And Carl Brennan?" "Still out there as far as I know. I've been monitoring law enforcement databases for 30 years, looking for any indication that his trafficking network has been shut down. I've never seen his name in any arrest records or prosecution databases." Jen realized that Billy Thompson wasn't just hiding from his past. He was hiding from people who might still want to hurt him. "What about your parents?" she asked. "Don't you think they deserve to know you're alive?" Billy's eyes filled with tears. "Every single day," he said. Every single day for 30 years, I've wanted to call them, to write them a letter, to show up at their door and tell them I'm okay. But I can't put them in danger. And I can't put myself in danger either. What kind of danger? The fake identity network that helped me, they're not exactly legitimate business people. They've kept Mike Davidson's background clean for over 20 years, but they know where I am and they know what I've been doing. If I suddenly surface as Billy Thompson, it exposes their entire operation to law enforcement scrutiny. Billy leaned back in his chair, looking exhausted. And there's something else, something I've never told anyone. Jen waited. Carl Brennan didn't just traffic kids for labor. He also sold some of us to people who wanted us for other reasons. Sexual exploitation, mostly. I was one of the lucky ones. I was big for my age and good with mechanical work, so I got sent to drug operations instead of other places. The implication hit Jen like a physical blow. Billy Thompson hadn't just been kidnapped and trafficked for labor. He'd been part of a network that included sexual exploitation of minors. But some of the other kids I knew, they weren't so lucky. And if Carl Brennan is still operating, still trafficking kids, then surfacing as Billy Thompson might expose me to retaliation from his network. Jen sat in silence, trying to process everything she'd learned. Billy Thompson was alive, but he couldn't safely reveal his identity. His parents had buried someone else's child, thinking it was their son. A trafficking network that had operated for decades was still potentially active. And somewhere in the American legal system, there were gaps and failures that had allowed all of this to happen. "What do you want me to do?" she asked finally. Billy looked at her with an expression of desperate hope mixed with terror. "I don't know," he said. "I've been asking myself that question for 30 years, and I still don't have an answer." Outside the coffee shop, Phoenix continued its normal afternoon rhythm. Cars drove past, people went about their business, and the desert sun beat down on a city that was home to millions of people living their ordinary lives. But inside the Starbucks, Jennifer Parker and Billy Thompson sat across from each other, separated by a small table and connected by a mystery that would challenge everything she thought she knew about identity, family, and the price of survival. "There might be a way," Jen said slowly, "but it would require using the same technology that found you to help prove who you really are." Billy looked at her with cautious curiosity. "The facial recognition software that identified you, it's not just useful for finding people. It can also be used to verify identity through aging analysis and biometric comparison. If we could get access to your parents' DNA or to physical evidence from your childhood, we might be able to build a legal case for proving that Billy Thompson is still alive, without exposing Mike Davidson's fake identity. That's the tricky part," Jen admitted. "But I work with law enforcement agencies that handle identity theft cases. There might be a way to approach this through victim services rather than criminal prosecution." Billy was quiet for a long time, staring at his hands. "My mom is dying," he said finally. "Yes, and you really think there's a chance I could see her again without putting her in danger?" Jen thought about the facial recognition software that had started this entire journey, the algorithms that could identify someone across decades of aging and change, the databases that could cross-reference identities, track movement patterns, and build comprehensive profiles of people's lives. The same technology that had found Billy Thompson could also be used to protect him. "I think," she said carefully, "that we live in a time when technology might be able to solve problems that seemed impossible just a few years ago. But it's not going to be simple, and it's not going to be without risks." Billy nodded slowly. "What would you need from me?" "Everything," Jen said. "Every detail about your kidnapping, your trafficking, the people who helped you get fake documents, the operations you worked in. Everything. And we'd need to do it in a way that protects both you and the investigation." "How?" Jen pulled out her laptop and opened the facial recognition software that had started their conversation. We start with what we know, your face, your identity, and the fact that you're alive. Then we use artificial intelligence to build a comprehensive case that proves Billy Thompson didn't die in 1995. She turned the laptop screen toward Billy, showing him the facial recognition analysis that had identified him with 94.7% accuracy. This software doesn't just compare faces. It can also predict aging patterns, verify identity through multiple biometric markers, and cross-reference data from thousands of sources. If we feed it enough information about Billy Thompson's early life and enough information about Mike Davidson's current life, it can build a statistical model that proves they're the same person. Billy stared at the screen, seeing his own face reflected in algorithms and data points. And that would be enough for law enforcement? Combined with other evidence, it could be. DNA analysis, handwriting comparison, childhood scars or medical records. There are dozens of ways to verify identity. The facial recognition software would just be the starting point. What about Carl Brennan? What about the trafficking network? Jen thought about her 5 years working with law enforcement agencies, about the cases she'd helped solve using facial recognition technology. That's where the AI becomes really powerful, she said. If we can identify patterns in missing person cases from the 1990s, if we can use predictive algorithms to track potential trafficking routes and victim profiles, we might be able to build a case against the entire network. You're talking about using artificial intelligence to solve crimes that happened 30 years ago. I'm talking about using artificial intelligence to solve crimes that are probably still happening today. Billy Thompson sat back in his chair, looking overwhelmed. This is what I was afraid of, Billy said quietly. Once this starts, there's no going back. Mike Davidson disappears forever, and Billy Thompson comes back to a world that's completely different from the one he left. Jen closed her laptop and looked at him directly. Your mother is dying, she said gently, and your father is 71 years old. They've spent 30 years believing their son is dead. Whatever risks we're taking, whatever complications this creates, don't you think they deserve to know the truth? Billy stared out the window at the Phoenix traffic, watching cars move through intersections in predictable patterns, guided by traffic lights and navigation systems. Everything in the modern world seemed to be tracked, monitored, and analyzed by computers. There's something else, he said. Something I haven't told you about, why I can't just walk away from Mike Davidson's life. What? I'm not the only one. There are other people living under fake identities, people who were helped by the same network that gave me Michael Davidson's documents. If I expose how I got my identity, I could be putting dozens of other trafficking victims at risk. Jen felt a chill of understanding. Billy Thompson wasn't just protecting himself. He was protecting an entire community of people who had escaped trafficking and abuse by assuming false identities. How many others? She asked. I don't know exactly, but over the years I've met people in Phoenix, Las Vegas, Albuquerque, people who have similar stories. People who were trafficked as children and rescued themselves by disappearing into new identities. They're all using dead babies' social security numbers? Not all. Some have completely fabricated identities. Some are using the papers of people who died in accidents or natural disasters. The network is sophisticated. They've been doing this since at least the 1980s, helping trafficking victims and abuse survivors start over with clean documentation. Jen realized she was looking at something much larger than a single missing person case. She was seeing evidence of an underground railroad for trafficking victims, a parallel identity system that had been operating outside the law for decades. But if that's true, she said, then what you're describing isn't just identity theft. It's victim services. It's people helping survivors rebuild their lives. Exactly. And if I surface as Billy Thompson, if I expose how I got Mike Davidson's identity, I could destroy the entire network. People who are currently safe could be forced back into dangerous situations. Billy pulled out his phone and showed her a photo from his camera roll. It was a group picture from a classic car show, showing him with a dozen other men standing beside their restored vehicles. 3 of the people in this photo are living under false identities, he said. One of them was trafficked from Mexico when he was 12 years old. Another was sold by his own parents to a child prostitution ring in Las Vegas. The third was kidnapped from a shopping mall in Colorado and held captive for 4 years. Jen stared at the photo, seeing ordinary-looking middle-aged men who appeared to be enjoying a hobby weekend. They all found their way to Phoenix. Phoenix, Tucson, Albuquerque, Las Vegas, cities in the Southwest where it's easier to blend in, where there are large populations of people who might not have perfect documentation, places where cash businesses are common, and people don't ask too many questions about your background. And they all know about each other? Not officially, but there's a network. People help each other find jobs, apartments, medical care. It's not organized crime. It's community support for people who have nowhere else to turn. Jen began to understand the full scope of what she'd discovered. The facial recognition software had led her to Billy Thompson, but Billy Thompson was part of a much larger story about survival, identity, and the gaps in the American legal system that allowed trafficking victims to fall through the cracks. What if there was a way to help your parents without exposing the network? She asked. How? Jen thought about the capabilities of modern artificial intelligence, about predictive algorithms and data analysis tools that could process information in ways that weren't possible even 5 years earlier. What if we could use AI to identify Carl Brennan and his trafficking network without revealing how we found the information? What if we could build a case that exposes the criminals without exposing the victims? Billy looked skeptical. You're talking about using computer software to solve a 30-year-old crime. I'm talking about using artificial intelligence to analyze patterns that human investigators missed. Missing person reports, unsolved disappearances, unidentified remains. There are databases full of information that no one has ever been able to connect because the scope was too large for manual analysis. Jen opened her laptop again and showed Billy a different software interface, a predictive analytics program designed for pattern recognition in criminal investigations. This software can analyze thousands of missing person cases simultaneously, looking for geographic patterns, timeline correlations, and suspect profiles. If Carl Brennan was trafficking children across multiple states for multiple years, there should be evidence in the data. Evidence that law enforcement missed. Evidence that couldn't be connected without artificial intelligence. Remember, this was happening in the 1990s, before digital databases and information sharing between jurisdictions. A kid disappearing in Iowa might never be connected to a kid disappearing in Colorado, even if they were taken by the same person. Billy stared at the screen, watching as the software processed data from the National Missing and Unidentified Persons System. If you could prove that Carl Brennan was responsible for multiple kidnappings, that would give law enforcement a reason to reopen my case without me having to surface as Billy Thompson. Exactly. And if we can prove that the body found in the Cedar River wasn't you, your parents could learn that you might still be alive without knowing exactly where you are or what identity you're using. It was a complicated plan, full of variables and potential risks. But for the first time since discovering Billy Thompson's photo in a Facebook group, Jen could see a path forward that might reunite a dying woman with her son without destroying the life he'd built or endangering the community that had helped him survive. There's one more thing, Billy said. If we're going to do this, if we're going to use artificial intelligence to investigate a 30-year-old trafficking network, I want to help. I know things about Carl Brennan's operation that aren't in any police database. I know locations, names, methods, Information that could help the AI identify patterns. Jen nodded. But we'd have to be careful about how we introduce that information. It can't be traced back to you directly. I understand. But I've been carrying this knowledge for 30 years, and if there's a chance it could help other victims or prevent future trafficking, I want to use it. A boomed. They sat in silence for several minutes, each processing the magnitude of what they were considering. Outside the coffee shop, Phoenix continued its normal afternoon rhythm, unaware that two people were planning to use cutting-edge technology to solve one of the most complex criminal cases in recent memory. How long would this take? Billy asked. I don't know. Weeks, maybe months. The AI analysis could take days or weeks depending on how much data we're processing. Building a legal case that law enforcement would act on could take much longer. My mother might not have months. Jen thought about Mary Thompson, dying of cancer in Cedar Falls, Iowa, still wondering what happened to her son 30 years earlier. There might be a way to give her some hope without revealing everything, she said. If we could prove that the body in the Cedar River wasn't Billy Thompson, that would at least tell her that her son might still be alive somewhere. And if she knows I might be alive, she might fight harder to stay alive until we can figure out the rest. Maybe. Billy pulled out his phone and showed Jen another photo from his camera roll. This one was a screenshot of Mary Thompson's Facebook page, showing her in a hospital bed surrounded by flowers and get-well cards. I've been following her posts for years, he said quietly. I know about every chemotherapy session, every doctor's appointment, every good day and bad day. I've wanted to comment, to send her a message, to somehow let her know that I'm thinking about her, but I couldn't risk it. She posts about you sometimes, Jen said, having done her own research on the Thompson family. Every year on your birthday, every year on the anniversary of your disappearance. She never stopped believing you might come home. Billy's eyes filled with tears. On my birthday last year, she posted a photo of my bedroom. She's kept it exactly the same for 30 years. My Chicago Bulls poster is still on the wall. My Stephen King books are still on the nightstand. She said in the post that she's kept it ready in case I ever come home. Jen felt her own eyes welling up with tears. The image of a mother maintaining her missing son's bedroom for 3 decades, keeping hope alive year after year, was almost too heartbreaking to process. We have to try, she said. Whatever the risks, whatever the complications, we have to try. Billy nodded, wiping his eyes with the back of his hand. How do we start? Jen opened her laptop and launched the predictive analytics software that would become the foundation of their investigation. We start with data, she said. Every missing person report from Iowa between 1990 and 2000. Every unidentified remain found in the Midwest during that same period. Every arrest record for anyone named Carl Brennan or matching his description. She began typing commands into the software interface, setting parameters for a comprehensive search of law enforcement databases. Then we expand geographically, missing persons from Colorado, Nevada, California, anywhere you remember being taken during your trafficking. We look for patterns that human investigators couldn't see because they didn't have access to the full scope of the data. And if the AI finds connections, then we have evidence to take to law enforcement. Not as Billy Thompson making accusations, but as concerned citizens reporting suspicious patterns in historical missing person cases. The software began processing their search requests, analyzing thousands of case files and looking for correlations that might have been missed by manual investigation. This could take hours or days to complete, Jen said. The AI has to cross-reference multiple databases and analyze complex patterns across decades of information. Billy watched the progress bar creep slowly across the screen. I've waited 30 years, he said. I can wait a few more days. But as the artificial intelligence began its analysis of missing person reports, trafficking patterns, and unidentified remains, neither Jen nor Billy could have predicted what it would discover. The algorithms would find connections that went far beyond Carl Brennan's trafficking network, revealing a systematic pattern of disappearances that suggested something much larger and more organized than either of them had imagined. The first results appeared on Jen's laptop screen at 6:47 p.m., just as the Phoenix sunset was painting the sky in brilliant oranges and purples. The AI had processed 847 missing person reports from the Midwest between 1990 and 2000, cross-referencing them with arrest records, unidentified remains, and geographic data. What it found was disturbing. "Look at this," Jen said, turning her laptop toward Billy. The screen showed a map of the United States with red dots indicating missing person reports and blue lines connecting them to show potential relationships. There were far more connections than either of them had expected. The software identified 23 missing person cases that show statistical similarities to your disappearance, Jen explained. Same age range, same geographic region, same time period, and same lack of resolution. Billy stared at the map, seeing red dots scattered across Iowa, Illinois, Wisconsin, and Minnesota. 23 kids? 23 reported cases, but look at this pattern. Jen clicked on individual dots, bringing up case details for each missing person report. Michael Chen, age 15, disappeared from Davenport, Iowa in September 1994. Sarah Williams, age 16, vanished from Rockford, Illinois in June 1995. David Martinez, age 14, went missing from La Crosse, Wisconsin in October 1995. All of them had disappeared while walking or biking alone in rural or suburban areas. All of them had left behind personal belongings, bicycles, backpacks, shoes, that were found days later in locations that suggested they'd been moved. None of them had ever been found. "This wasn't just Carl Brennan operating alone," Billy said quietly. "This was an organized network." "And look at this," Jen said, clicking on another part of the analysis. The AI cross-referenced these missing person reports with arrest records for anyone named Carl Brennan. It found 7 different people with that name who were arrested for various crimes during the 1990s, but only one who matches the physical description you gave me. She brought up a mugshot from 1998 showing a man in his late 30s with brown hair, brown eyes, and a distinctive scar on his left cheek. Carl Michael Brennan, arrested in Bakersfield, California, for possession of stolen property, released on bail and never appeared for his court date. Billy stared at the photograph, his face going pale. "That's him," he said. "That's the man who kidnapped me." The AI found something else. This arrest record lists an associate named Russell Davies, who was also charged in the stolen property case. Davies was arrested again in 2001 for human trafficking in Nevada. Jen brought up another arrest record, showing a man in his 40s with graying hair and tattoos covering both arms. Russell Davies was convicted and sentenced to 15 years in federal prison for trafficking minors across state lines. He was released in 2016 and is currently living in Las Vegas under supervised parole. Billy sat back in his chair, processing the implications. "You're telling me that the AI found evidence connecting Carl Brennan to other trafficking cases, and one of his associates is still alive and traceable?" "Not just traceable, monitored. Davies is required to report to a parole officer monthly and submit to regular drug testing. The AI found his current address, his employment records, and his known associates." Jen opened another screen, showing Davies' parole records and current information. "If we could get law enforcement to interview Davies about his association with Carl Brennan, he might provide information about the trafficking network without us having to reveal your identity." "But Davies knows me. If law enforcement starts asking about Carl Brennan's operation and they mention anything about victims from Iowa, Davies might remember me." "That's a risk," Jen admitted. But there's something else the AI found that might help. She brought up a different analysis showing financial records and property ownership data. Carl Brennan owned property in 3 different states between 1995 and 1999, a cabin in northern Minnesota, a farmhouse in rural Colorado, and a warehouse in Nevada. All 3 properties were sold or abandoned after 1999, but the AI was able to track the ownership histories and find connections to other missing person cases. The cabin in Minnesota, that's where he took me first. And according to the analysis, there were at least 6 other missing person reports from nearby areas during the time period when Brennan owned that property. Billy stared at the screen, seeing evidence of a trafficking operation that was much larger than he'd realized. "How many kids do you think went through that cabin?" "I don't know," Jen said. But the AI analysis suggests it could have been dozens over several years. They sat in silence, both overwhelmed by the scope of what they'd discovered. What had started as a facial recognition match had led them to evidence of a trafficking network that had operated across multiple states for nearly a decade. "There's one more thing," Jen said. "The AI found 3 unidentified remains from the 1990s that were discovered near properties owned by Carl Brennan, 2 in Minnesota, 1 in Colorado." She brought up forensic reports showing skeletal remains that had been found by hikers and hunters in remote wooded areas. All 3 were adolescents, age 14-17, based on bone analysis. All 3 had been dead for several years when they were discovered, and all 3 were found within 50 miles of properties connected to Brennan. Billy closed his eyes, remembering other children he'd met during his time in captivity. Kids who had been sick, injured, or unable to work. Kids who had simply disappeared one day and never come back. "They killed some of us," he said quietly. "The AI can't prove that Carl Brennan was responsible for these deaths. But the statistical correlation is significant enough that law enforcement would probably be interested in investigating further." Jen saved the analysis and closed her laptop. "We have enough evidence to approach law enforcement with a credible theory about a historical trafficking network," she said. "We can present this as concerned citizens who used artificial intelligence to identify patterns in cold cases, without mentioning Billy Thompson or Mike Davidson. Without mentioning either identity directly, we present the analysis as a computer-generated hypothesis about connected crimes, and we let law enforcement decide whether to investigate further." Billy thought about the implications of what they were planning. If law enforcement reopens these cases, if they start investigating Carl Brennan and Russell Davies, there's a chance they'll eventually connect the dots back to my disappearance. And if they do, you could choose to reveal your identity at that time, or you could continue to remain hidden while the investigation proceeds. "What about my parents? What about my mother's cancer?" Jen had been thinking about that problem throughout their conversation. "We could approach this in phases," she said. "First, we give law enforcement the AI analysis and let them start investigating the trafficking network. If they find evidence that supports our theory, that creates a foundation for questioning the identification of the body found in the Cedar River. And then we could present additional evidence, maybe through an anonymous tip, suggesting that the body found in 1995 might not have been Billy Thompson. We don't have to provide proof of where Billy is now, just evidence that he might still be alive. That would give my parents hope without putting me at risk. It would give them hope, and it would also put pressure on law enforcement to use DNA analysis and other modern forensic techniques to re-examine the remains." Billy nodded slowly, seeing the logic in Jen's approach. "And if the remains are proven not to be Billy Thompson? Then your parents know their son might still be alive. Law enforcement has an active investigation into the trafficking network that actually took you, and you maintain your current identity and safety. It was a complex plan with multiple variables and potential failure points. But for the first time since his disappearance 30 years earlier, Billy Thompson could see a path that might lead to justice for the crimes committed against him and closure for the family that had never stopped looking for him. "When do we contact law enforcement?" he asked. "Tomorrow," Jen said. "I'll compile the AI analysis into a formal report and submit it to the FBI's National Center for Missing and Exploited Children. They have the resources to investigate multi-state trafficking cases and the authority to coordinate with local law enforcement agencies. And then we wait? And then we wait to see if artificial intelligence can solve a crime that human investigators couldn't crack for 30 years. As the Phoenix evening settled into darkness around them, Jennifer Parker and Billy Thompson sat in a coffee shop planning to use cutting-edge technology to expose a decades-old trafficking network. Neither of them could predict whether their plan would succeed, whether it would endanger other victims, or whether it would finally bring Billy Thompson home to his dying mother. But they both knew that after 30 years of silence, it was time to let artificial intelligence tell the truth about what had happened to the children who had disappeared into Carl Brennan's trafficking network. The next morning, Jen spent 4 hours in her hotel room writing a comprehensive report based on the AI analysis. She documented every connection the software had identified, every pattern it had detected, and every piece of evidence linking Carl Brennan to multiple missing person cases across 4 states. The report was 47 pages long and included detailed statistical analysis, geographic mapping, timeline correlations, and photographic evidence. She presented it as an independent research project conducted by a private citizen using publicly available databases and artificial intelligence tools. At 11:23 a.m. Mountain Standard Time, she submitted the report electronically to the FBI's National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, the Iowa Division of Criminal Investigation, and the National Missing and Unidentified Persons System. Then she and Billy waited. The first response came faster than either of them had expected. At 2:15 p.m., Jen received a phone call from Special Agent Monica Hayes at the FBI's Denver field office. "Ms. Parker, this is Special Agent Hayes with the FBI. I've reviewed your report about potential connections between historical missing person cases in the Midwest. I'd like to discuss your findings with you as soon as possible." Jen felt her heart racing. The FBI was taking their analysis seriously. "I'm currently in Phoenix," she said, "but I can fly to Denver if necessary." "That won't be required. I can conduct an initial interview via video conference this afternoon, and we can determine what additional steps might be needed based on what you tell me." 3 hours later, Jen sat in her hotel room with Billy, both of them staring at her laptop screen as Special Agent Hayes appeared via encrypted video call. Hayes was a woman in her early 40s, with short brown hair and wire-rimmed glasses, wearing a navy blue FBI jacket. "Ms. Parker, I've had a chance to review your artificial intelligence analysis in detail," Hayes said. "Your findings are remarkable, and they align with some ongoing investigations that I can't discuss in detail. I need to ask you some questions about how you obtained this information and what motivated you to conduct this research." Jen had prepared for this conversation carefully, knowing that she needed to provide enough information to maintain credibility without revealing Billy's identity or current location. "I work as a facial recognition specialist for a tech company in Portland," she said. "I grew up in Cedar Falls, Iowa, and I've always been interested in the Billy Thompson missing person case from 1995. When I acquired access to advanced AI analysis tools, I decided to use them to look for patterns that might have been missed in the original investigation. And you conducted this analysis independently? You're not working with law enforcement or any private investigation firm? Completely independently. I used publicly available databases and software tools that I have access to through my employment." Special Agent Hayes made notes on a legal pad as Jen spoke. "Your analysis identifies Carl Michael Brennan as a person of interest in multiple missing person cases. Do you have any direct information about Mr. Brennan's current whereabouts or activities?" No direct information. The AI analysis shows that he hasn't been arrested or had any documented law enforcement contact since 1998. What about Russell Davies, the associate you identified through the artificial intelligence research? According to the analysis, Davies is currently living in Las Vegas under federal parole supervision. The AI found his current address and employment information through public records databases. Hayes nodded, continuing to take notes. Ms. Parker, I'm going to be direct with you. Your AI analysis has identified connections that align with intelligence we've been developing about historical trafficking networks in the Southwest. We've been investigating similar patterns for the past 2 years, but we haven't had access to the comprehensive data analysis that your software was able to generate. Jen felt a surge of excitement mixed with terror. The FBI was confirming that their analysis was accurate and relevant to ongoing investigations. Does that mean you'll be investigating the cases we identified? It means we'll be expanding our current investigation to include the historical cases your analysis identified. We'll be interviewing Russell Davies within the next week, and we'll be coordinating with local law enforcement agencies in Iowa, Illinois, Wisconsin, and Minnesota to review the missing person cases you've connected. Billy, who had been listening silently, gestured to Jen with a question in his eyes. Agent Hayes, Jen said, one of the cases the AI identified was Billy Thompson from Cedar Falls, Iowa. According to our analysis, there are statistical anomalies in that case that suggest it might be connected to the trafficking network. What kind of anomalies? The AI analysis suggests that the body found in the Cedar River and identified as Billy Thompson shows inconsistencies with the missing person profile. The timing of the discovery, the location, and the method of identification all show patterns that are statistically unusual compared to legitimate drowning cases. Hayes looked up from her notes, clearly interested. Are you suggesting that the body found in 1995 might not have been Billy Thompson? I'm suggesting that modern forensic techniques, DNA analysis, artificial intelligence-assisted identification, advanced skeletal analysis, might be able to provide more definitive identification than was possible in 1995. And you believe this is relevant to the trafficking investigation? If Billy Thompson was actually kidnapped by Carl Brennan rather than drowning accidentally, then his case represents additional evidence of the trafficking network's scope and methods. Special Agent Hayes was quiet for several minutes, apparently consulting documents that Jen couldn't see. Ms. Parker, based on your analysis and our ongoing investigation, I'm going to recommend that the FBI coordinate with Iowa law enforcement to reopen the Billy Thompson case. We'll request exhumation and DNA analysis of the remains found in 1995, and we'll investigate potential connections to the trafficking network you've identified. Jen felt tears welling up in her eyes. After 30 years, Billy Thompson's case was finally going to be reopened with modern forensic techniques and the full resources of federal law enforcement. How long might that process take? She asked. Exhumation orders and DNA analysis can take weeks or months, depending on court schedules and laboratory backlogs, but we'll expedite the process given the potential connections to ongoing trafficking investigations. And the family? Billy Thompson's parents? We'll coordinate with Iowa law enforcement to notify the family that new evidence has prompted us to reopen the case. We'll be sensitive to their situation, but they deserve to know that we're using modern techniques to investigate their son's disappearance. After the video call ended, Jen and Billy sat in stunned silence in the hotel room. Everything they had hoped for was actually happening. The FBI was reopening Billy's case, investigating the trafficking network, and using DNA analysis to determine whether the body found in 1995 was actually Billy Thompson. My parents are going to know, Billy said quietly. They're going to know that I might still be alive. Are you ready for that? Billy thought about the question for a long time. "I've been ready for 30 years, he said finally, "but now that it's actually happening, I'm terrified." "What scares you most? That they'll find out I'm alive, and then I'll have to choose between staying hidden and putting everyone at risk, or revealing myself and destroying the life I've built." Jen understood his dilemma. Billy Thompson had survived trafficking, built a new identity, and created a successful life for himself. But he'd also spent 30 years living with the knowledge that his parents believed he was dead. "There might be a middle path," she said. "If the DNA analysis proves that the body wasn't you, if the FBI investigation exposes the trafficking network, there might be a way for you to safely reveal your identity without endangering yourself or others." How? If Carl Brennan and his associates are arrested and prosecuted, if the trafficking network is shut down, then the main threat to your safety disappears. You could come forward as a victim who survived and rebuilt his life, rather than as someone trying to expose active criminals. Billy nodded, seeing the logic in her reasoning. "But that could take years. My mother might not have years." Jen had been thinking about that problem as well. "There might be a way to give her hope without revealing everything," she said. "If the FBI tells your parents that new evidence suggests you might still be alive, that could give her a reason to keep fighting her cancer while we wait for the investigation to conclude. Hope without certainty. Hope based on evidence. Hope based on modern forensic science and artificial intelligence analysis. Not false hope, but realistic possibility." Billy walked to the hotel room window, looking out at the Phoenix skyline in the distance. 30 years, he said. 30 years of wondering if I'd ever see them again. 30 years of watching them online, knowing they thought I was dead. And now there's a chance that might change. Because of facial recognition software and artificial intelligence. Jen joined him at the window, looking out at a city where thousands of people were living their ordinary lives, unaware that technology was about to solve one of the most complex missing person cases in recent memory. Technology that can find anyone, anywhere, at any time, she said. Technology that can analyze patterns that human investigators could never see. Technology that can connect cases across decades and thousands of miles. Technology that gave Billy Thompson a chance to come home. They stood in silence, watching the Phoenix traffic move through intersections, guided by computer-controlled traffic lights, in a world where artificial intelligence was becoming an invisible force that connected, analyzed, and revealed truths that had been hidden for decades. In Cedar Falls, Iowa, Mary Thompson was undergoing her third round of chemotherapy, not knowing that her son was alive and that federal investigators were about to tell her that modern technology had found new evidence in his case. In Las Vegas, Nevada, Russell Davies was reporting to his parole officer, not knowing that artificial intelligence had connected him to a decades-old trafficking investigation that was about to destroy whatever quiet life he'd built since his release from federal prison. And in Phoenix, Arizona, Billy Thompson was standing in a hotel room window, looking at a future that might finally allow him to reclaim his real name and see his parents again. 30 years after disappearing into a trafficking network that artificial intelligence had finally exposed. The technology that found him would also be the technology that brought him home. But as federal investigators began the complex process of reopening a 30-year-old case, none of them could have predicted that the artificial intelligence analysis would reveal connections that went far beyond Carl Brennan's trafficking network, exposing a systematic pattern of disappearances that suggested institutional failures in American law enforcement that had allowed hundreds of children to vanish without adequate investigation or follow-up. The same algorithms that identified Billy Thompson would ultimately reveal that he was just one victim in a much larger story about privacy, surveillance, identity, and the unintended consequences of living in a world where artificial intelligence could see patterns that human beings had missed for decades. What started as a missing person case would become a comprehensive examination of how technology could both destroy and rebuild human lives, how artificial intelligence could solve crimes that seemed unsolvable, and how the same systems that enabled trafficking and abuse could eventually be used to expose and prosecute the people responsible. Jennifer Parker had used facial recognition software to find a missing person in a Facebook photo. But she had also opened a window into the dark side of American society that technology was finally powerful enough to illuminate and possibly to heal.